They come up with this idea, for instance, that there are indigenous people who were moved out. The Palestinians are indigenous people, and they were moved out by the Jews. You can do that if you want. Now let's do Britain. You want to play the indigenous people own the land first game, and the other people should fuck off? I do not want to live in a country with Hamas supporters. I want them deported. I want them chucked out. Simple. If there are people in the UK who are offended by the posters of missing Jewish children, they must leave.
Douglas, you're back for I don't know which time, but we've had you on many times. And I put it to you that there's good news and bad news. The good news is that you were right. The bad news is that you were right. What have you made of the last 3 weeks?
I suppose like all of us, it's a mixture of things. First shock, then horror, then shock again, then horror, then disappointment, and then rage, probably, in roughly that order. Horror at what happened in Israel, shock like everyone, this was able to happen. Horror at the details of what happened, shock then at the response on the streets of cities like the one we're sitting in London. The fact that there were so many people who didn't even give it a day before they turned out on the streets of my city, supporting the people who'd done this act of terror. And then in the weeks since, increasing rage. Rage that I have to share a country with these people.
And I think the thing that we've all had to come to terms with is how some people have just been so open about supporting an extremist Islamist terrorist group and also refusing to acknowledge it as such.
Well, before you answer, Douglas, one of the things that I've noticed in comments is people like, well, these are pro-Palestine marches. And I think we have to be clear that what we're talking about is in the first 2 days prior to Israel responding in any way, there were people celebrating.
Yeah, the bodies of the dead hadn't even been found. They were still warm in some cases. Some people were still in the process of being massacred. And even as that was still going on, people were already out on the streets of cities like London, protesting against Israel. And that was what it was. It was straight away a protest against Israel. And, look, there are lots of fine delineations you can do about it, some of which are true and some are not. You could claim that the people who've come out in recent weekends on the Saturdays care about Palestinian lives. I don't think they do. I just don't think they do.
Douglas Murray argues that supporting Hamas is unacceptable and those that do should be deported from the UK. He expresses shock and horror at the recent events in Israel and anger towards those in London who quickly protest Israel. How do we reconcile freedom of speech with support for extremist groups?
People, including leaders of other countries in the region, to know the Jordanians do not like the Palestinians at all. They find them an unbelievable encumbrance, and that's why they haven't opened their borders to the people in the West Bank who should effectively be in Jordan. The Egyptians loathe the Palestinians. The authorities are keeping the border between Egypt and Gaza closed because they hate the Palestinians. I know people who were born in Gaza when Gaza was owned by Egypt. If Egypt wanted to solve the Gaza problem, it could do so tomorrow by taking control of Gaza or allowing the people of Gaza to go into Egypt, where they should be. Nobody else in the region cares. The Qataris host Hamas and fund Hamas, as well as, of course, pumping billions of pounds into countries like this one to make us deeply compromised. But nobody in the region cares about the Palestinians. Certainly nobody cares about them more than the Israelis, who go to incredible efforts to try to limit the deaths and the mistreatment of the Palestinians, even as the whole region, the world, has given them these people to look after. Nobody really cares about the Palestinians, and frankly, the idea that Muslims care about their brother Muslims is absolute rubbish. I think we've flattered much of the so-called Muslim street by even pretending this in recent years. Hundreds of thousands of Muslims have been killed in Yemen in the last few years, and there hasn't been a protest 1% of the size of what we've seen in recent days and weeks in the West. Hundreds of thousands of Muslims have been killed in Syria in the last over a decade, since the civil war in Syria, by Assad, by the Assad regime, by rival jihadist groups, by intra-religious sects, and much more. And we haven't seen 1% of the people who turned out on the streets this day. The idea that Muslims actually care about their fellow Muslims is insane. They don't. What they care about is Jews. There is something at the very root of Islam and followers of the Muslim religion who cannot bear any war in which Israel is fighting, and most of all loathes any war in which Israel is winning. And you can see it. It's at the absolute core of their being. This is why they are on the streets of this city and others marching. It's not because they love fellow Muslims, it's because they hate Jews.
So you're saying there's something at the root of the religion. Well, let's tease that apart. What do you mean by that?
Well, there's two particular things worth mentioning. One is, of course, that Muhammad, the founder of Islam, himself beheaded, massacred many, many Jews. Famously, there's one battle in particular, and the Banu Quraysh, it's a story.
Douglas Murray asserts that Middle Eastern countries, including Egypt and Jordan, have little sympathy for Palestinians, despite claims of Muslim unity. He argues that global protests against Israel reveal underlying anti-Semitism rather than genuine concern for Muslims, citing historical conflicts and religious narratives. How can global perceptions of conflict in the Middle East be balanced with historical and religious contexts to foster better understanding?
About it knows is that it's a shape-shifting virus. At one point in the history of Europe, in the history of our own country, the Jews were hated because they were poor, and then they were hated because they were rich. They were hated for not integrating, and then they were hated for integrating. In the era where you could hate people for their religion, they were hated for their religion. Then when that not became impossible in Europe, you couldn't hate people for their religion, they were hated for their race. Then at a particular point in Europe, we discovered we couldn't hate people for their race anymore. So what did we hate people for if they were Jewish? We hated them for being stateless. Then the Jewish people got a state, and they were hated for having a state. Now, you cannot tell me in this situation that there's a coincidence here. It is not a coincidence that every way you do it, it ends up like that. And great figures, including somebody I've quoted a lot in recent days and weeks, Vasily Grossman, the great Russian novelist, the author of Life and Fate, among other works.
And everything flows.
He said everything comes from this. And of course, the great thing that Grossman said, the heart of his great novel, in those few pages where he writes about anti-Semitism, about the dark heart of the 20th century, as he goes from Stalingrad to Treblinka, the great pages in which Grossman takes the time out to talk about anti-Semitism in the midnight of the 20th century. He says, of course, that he says some of what I've just said about anti-Semitism being a shape-shifting virus, because, of course, Hitler had it, as rather well known, but Stalin ended up with it as well. I mean, it goes every direction, everywhere. But as Grossman greatly says, the thing about it is that it tells you about the person who suffers from it, not about the Jews. He says, tell me what you accuse the Jews of, I'll tell you what you're guilty of. People who hate the Jews for being religious have religious problems themselves. People who hate the fact that Jews have a state that they're willing to defend have a problem with defending their own state themselves, and much, much more, on and on and on.
The thing that, and I've made this point in previous interviews, so I have a grandfather originally from Lebanon, Coptic Christian, but he was an anti-Semite. Mm-hmm. And people don't understand, when people comment in the West, they don't understand the depths of hatred that exists in that region. Mm. And when I say the word hatred, I mean it in its truest sense of the word. People in the West, they don't understand that emotion in the way that it's expressed over there.
They don't anymore. They could do in the years to come, yeah.
Douglas Murray highlights the evolution of anti-Semitism for religious and racial hatred to opposition against Jewish statehood in Israel, emphasizing its pervasive nature across history. How can global perspectives on Israel's security challenges benefit from understanding these complex historical shifts?
Shameless way killed by a jihadist who sat beside his body, very pleased with his work. And if you listened to the debate in the House the next day or a couple of days later in memory of Sir David Amess, who was killed, just over 2 years ago? If you listened to the debate in the House, you'd have thought he died of natural causes. I think his colleagues behaved shamefully. They all said how much they wanted to pay tribute to his memory. Well, they didn't. They didn't. They betrayed his memory. He was killed by somebody who was an Islamic extremist, supremacist, jihadist, call him what you want. The whole of the House of Commons covered for that. Now, some people said to me, Douglas, you cannot point this out. You might jeopardize the trial. The reason they're not saying this is because they don't want to say these things ahead of the trial. This man is simply the suspect. The one you found covered in Sir David's blood beside the body. Yes, of course, he's still a suspect. You mustn't prejudge the motives. We'll put that discussion off for another time. When is the other time? The other time is after the sentencing. Oh, good, I look forward to it. After the sentencing. Anything? Crickets. In this country, in Britain, we can't seem to summon up the guts to talk about this anytime. And you know why? Because no one knows what to do.
I would say it's because they're scared, Douglas, if I'm honest. They're terrified because they're part of them are thinking, and they look at Sir David. And I actually met Sir David. He was a wonderful man, really.
Lovely man.
An English eccentric in the best sense of the word. But they're looking at him, and they've sat down, and they've eaten lunch with him, and they've drunk with him, and they think, shit, that could be me.
Well, you know what? Joe Cox was also killed by an extremist, a lone wolf madman who seems to have been inspired by some kind of neo-Nazi ideology and one of these kind of loser fringe of the most fringe people. And I don't remember, after Joe Cox's murder, people saying, let's not prejudge why the murderer did it, or let's not spread any blame around. I don't remember that. I missed that. There was an awful lot of spreading of blame around. They tried to blame everybody who was about to vote Brexit for the murder. They wanted to blame the whole Leave EU campaign for the murder. So I didn't see any lack of prejudging there. But I also didn't notice that MPs were quiet in identifying the ideology of the man who had murdered their colleague. So why did they not fear gangs of neo-Nazi men coming around and stabbing and decapitating MPs in the name of neo-Nazism? Because it's not a very big thing in Britain, despite the bogeyman holding out of neo-Nazis as always being about to take over. Don't forget, of course, we live in a country where the left, The Guardian and others repeatedly describe Suella Braverman as far right. So, although they use that language,
in this passionate segment, Douglas Murray criticizes the reluctance of British MPs to acknowledge Islamist extremism as the motive behind Sir David Amess's murder, contrasting it with the response to Joe Cox's killing by a neo-Nazi. He questions why there's a hesitancy to confront Islamist extremism openly while swiftly addressing other forms of extremism. How can societies effectively confront and discuss different forms of extremism without succumbing to political or ideological bias?
I can to ensure that happens. I am fed up, by the way, of the centrist dad hand-wringing era, where people say, oh, but might it be against our liberal values, and might our liberalism... I'm not as interested in that as I am in Britain remaining Britain. I am much more interested in that. At every time of national emergency in our nation's history, we gave something up to survive. We did in the Napoleonic Wars, we did in the wars of the 20th century, and we will have to now. This is the thing we give up, extending tolerance to people who do not extend it back to us. It should be over, that era. The first person who must be deported from the UK and have his citizenship withdrawn is a man called Mohammed Sawalha who lives in North London. I am happy to start handing out his address if need be. Mohammed Sawalha is a former military commander of Hamas in the West Bank. He has been living peacefully in the UK, that is undisturbedly, I should say, undisturbed in the UK for many years now. Under the last Labour government, he seems to have got UK citizenship. Now, to get UK citizenship, you have, among other things, to show that you're a person of good character. I would submit that if you are a military commander of Hamas, you are not a person of good character. Now, what is to be done about this man? He is currently not in the UK. He is in Istanbul. And again, I'm very happy to give out his location, should people want it. I do not want that man back in my country. I don't want him here. If he arrives back here, he should be arrested and deported. Now, I would also like him to go to the Gaza. Mohammed Sawalha should not be in the UK. The name of this man is now out there. It was put on the front page of the Sunday Times a couple of weeks ago. I immediately got my lawyers to write to the Home Secretary, the Prime Minister, the Director of Public Prosecutions, and the Attorney General, saying that if they do not prosecute him, I will get a prosecution myself. This man cannot live in my country. He will be the first, and we will see how many more need to come after him. He should not have British citizenship. We do not want him here. We have not benefited from his being here. Let me throw one other name straight out there who should be on the same list. A man called Mohajerani, the former Deputy Prime Minister of Iran. He lives in Harrow. Again, I'm very happy to start giving his address out. Why does he live in Leafy Harrow, this man? We don't know. The last Labour government gave him right to remain in the UK. Who is Mohajerani? Two things might be of interest. One, he was the man who the Ayatollah Khomeini got to write the book-length justification of the fatwa calling for the murder of the British novelist Salman Rushdie. Why is Salman Rushdie's life in such peril and has been since Valentine's Day 1989, and Mohajerani lives peacefully in Leafy Harrow? I don't want him to. Second, apart from justifying and calling for the murder of a British novelist, Mohajerani was also involved in the prison massacres of leftists and communists in Iran in the 1980s. One of his former colleagues has been prosecuted for war crimes in a European court in the last year. I see no reason why Mohajerani should not also be prosecuted.
Douglas Murray passionately argues for the deportation of individuals he deems threats to the UK's integrity. He specifically names Mohammed Sawalha, a former Hamas military commander, and Mohajerani, the former Iranian deputy prime minister, criticizing their peaceful residence in the UK despite their controversial pasts. Murray calls for immediate legal action to revoke their citizenships and expel them from the country. Should the UK take a stronger stance on revoking citizenship for individuals involved in foreign conflicts or controversial activities, even if they have lived peacefully in the country for years?
Going around online, I mean, these people specifically that you're talking about, I think few would argue about.
Oh, I bet they would. Anyway, well, if they don't argue about it, why not do it?
Quite. And I want to come back to that as well. But the one thing I see is particularly American commentators say, well, look, the right in particular has been banging on about free speech endlessly. And then you have these people go out on a protest and suddenly everyone's saying they should be deported. What do you say to those people?
First of all, not everyone's saying they should be deported. A small number of us are. Yeah, I have some friends on the sort of libertarian right, as it were, as well as people on the left who say, but you're such a free speech activist. How could you deny the rights of free speech to people who simply want to stand outside synagogues taunting Jews for the murder of their fellow Jews? Well, this is not a practice of free speech. This is not an interesting test case of free speech. It's very straightforward. Throughout our history, as I mentioned earlier, we have repeatedly been willing to say that certain things trump our most cherished values, and the main one is our ability to survive. I would say that, at the moment, we are at a very important point, not least with policing in the UK. The protests that have taken place in recent weeks, and the protests that have already been announced for the weeks ahead, have been a great test for the Metropolitan Police and other police forces across the UK. And it is a test that they have failed monumentally. Now, I know the policing decision they've made. Part of the policing decision, clearly, is that they will observe the crowd and they will see if anyone breaks the law. And if they do break the law, they may get a visit at some point later from the police, and they may be arrested. This happened in the 2000s.
Douglas Murray criticizes the UK's police approach to handling protests, arguing that they have failed to effectively manage recent demonstrations. He highlights the practice of policing by observing crowds and arresting offenders later, which he believes only showcases the crime but not the follow-up actions. Murray uses historical references such as Anjum Chowdhury's group to illustrate his point that the world is watching and disapproves of the current policing methods. Should law enforcement prioritize immediate action during protests to prevent the perception of lawlessness, even if it risks potential escalations?